Welcome to class, everyone. Go ahead and find your seats. I am absolutely thrilled to be your professor for today's Explainer, where we're going to dig into the fascinating push and pull history of American voting rights. You know, we often tend to think of history as this straight, upward line of progress, right? But as we're about to explore today, the reality is far more dynamic, is actually much more like a pendulum. To really ground our lecture, I want to start us off with this core academic thesis from political science professor David Schultz. He makes this brilliant observation that we actually have two distinct tendencies in American history. On one hand, sure, we see a gradual expansion toward a universal franchise. But at the exact same time, there's been this historical counterpush to disenfranchise. So today, we're going to use the historical evidence in this explainer to track these two competing forces. Here's our syllabus for today's explainer. We'll cover the core voting thesis, early limits, expanding the electorate, federal muscle, accessibility reforms, and finally, the modern counterpush. Section 1. The core voting thesis, setting the stage. Section 2. Early limits and state control, the foundation. Okay, let's dive into this. Cast your mind back to the constitutional compromises of 1787 and 1788. The whole concept of a representative democracy was totally brand new. So I want you to think critically about this for a second. When the U.S. Constitution was actually adopted, who was legally allowed to vote? We always hear the phrase, "we the people," but how broadly did that actually apply at the time? Well, the reality is that the electorate was incredibly narrow by our modern standards. Because the original Constitution explicitly left voting rights up to individual states, which was partly a compromise over slavery, you generally had to meet a very strict set of requirements. You had to be white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, male, a property owner, and older than 21. That was the baseline. To put that into perspective, in those early elections, only about 6% of the entire population was actually eligible to cast a ballot. Just 6%. Section 3. Expanding the American electorate, the first push. This is where we really begin to see Professor Schultz's thesis in action, that gradual expansion of the franchise. It's a timeline of the first major expansion tendency, but notice the massive gaps in time here. Progress was a slow, grueling grind, definitely not an overnight victory. In 1870, the 15th Amendment finally granted black men the right to vote. Then you fast forward 50 long years of struggle to 1920, and the 19th Amendment is adopted, granting women the right to vote. In 1924, Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act for Native Americans. And then in 1943, the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act allowed Chinese immigrants and their American-born families to finally gain citizenship and voting rights. But here is a critical Socratic question for the class. Did these constitutional amendments, specifically the 15th and the 19th, actually guarantee the vote for all minorities and women in everyday practice? The answer is a resounding no, and this introduces the counter-push part of our thesis. This is a crucial vocabulary term for your notes, folks. During the Jim Crow era, mostly southern states enacted a whole series of discriminatory tools. We're talking poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and literally impossible literacy tests where voters were asked absurd questions like, how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? All of this, along with outright intimidation, was used to suppress minority voting rights for nearly a century. So the right existed on paper, sure, but the reality on the ground was strict disenfranchisement. Section 4. Federal Muscle and the VRA, the Golden Age of Expansion. Let's move to the 1960s and see how this builds. It became glaringly obvious that the federal government needed to step in to actually enforce the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. It's a rapid succession of major milestones here. In 1961, D.C. residents finally get the right to vote for president. In 1964, the 24th Amendment officially bans those discriminatory poll taxes we just talked about. 1965 brings the landmark Voting Rights Act. And by 1971, largely because so many young men were being drafted to fight in Vietnam, the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age to 18. Let's focus on the absolute cornerstone of that era, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As Professor Schultz explains it, the VRA essentially functioned like a second Reconstruction. It banned literacy tests completely and provided federal voting examiners. But most importantly, it put absolute federal muscle behind the 15th Amendment. States basically knew that if they didn't protect voting rights, the Department of Justice was going to step in and force them to. Section 5. Accessibility and Process Reforms. Making voting easier. Heading into the late 20th century, the conversation kind of shifted. It wasn't just about the legal right to vote anymore, it became about logistical accessibility. Voting was fundamentally modernized in three really distinct legislative steps. First, in 1984, federal law finally mandated polling place accessibility for elderly and disabled voters. Second, the 1993 Motor Voter Law completely revolutionized registration by letting people simply register at the DMV. And third, the 2002 Help America Vote Act provided federal funds for sweeping equipment and process reforms across the board. To truly grasp the impact of making voting easier, consider this number. Over 30 million voters updated or completed their voter registration in just the first year of the 1993 Motor Voter Law alone. 30 million. That is the sheer power of logistical expansion. Section 6. The modern disenfranchisement counterpush. The pendulum swings back. Now, what's really interesting about this next era is how it brings us right back to our core thesis. This is where we see that historical tension play out in our modern era. After decades of federal oversight expanding access, recent Supreme Court decisions have begun returning power back to the individual states, effectively walking back the scope of the Voting Rights Act. The pendulum swings again. There are two pivotal rulings you need to write down for your notes. First, in 2013, Shelby County v. Holder struck down the pre-clearance requirement. This freed states with historical records of discrimination to change their election laws without needing federal approval first. Then, in 2026, Louisiana v. Kalis struck down a voting map, which significantly raised the legal bar for states attempting to draw maps designed to help minority communities elect candidates. We can see the direct, real-world impact of the pendulum swinging back toward state control. Following the Shelby decision, at least 23 states responded by enacting newly restrictive voting rules. As a result, we saw polling stations being closed, strict statewide voter ID laws enacted, and limits placed on both mail-in voting and early voting hours. And this brilliantly illustrates our entire lecture today. On one side, we have the historical drive to expand access through things like motor voter laws and VRA federal examiners, but on the exact opposite side, we see those counter-push restrictions, things like polling place closures and strict voter ID laws. It's a constant historical tug-of-war playing out right in front of us. So, as we wrap up today's class, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. The history of voting rights in America is absolutely not a closed book. It's a living, breathing, and completely nonlinear process. As the pendulum continues to swing back and forth between expansion and restriction, who will be shaping the electorate of tomorrow? Class dismissed, everyone. Keep exploring.